Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Bob, for a terrific paper. In spite of it, my ignorance of medieval philosophy remains both broad and deep, so I won't be trying to say anything historical in this paper. Instead, I'll be picking up on three philosophical points. These are as follows. Number one, I'll be talking about O and S modality. What do I mean by that? I'll be giving an explication in modern terms of the notions of possibility that we associate with Occam and Scotus. In the second part, I'll be talking about a matter on which Occam and Scotus agreed, namely the necessity of the past. I'll argue that the connection between the necessity of the past and the failure of conversion, the fact that what's impossible can't become true, even though what's true can become impossible, I'll argue that that connection is not there. The third point is a point on which Occam and Scotus disagree. Scotus insisted that in order for an act to be free, it had to be possible at the time of its occurrence, that it should have been otherwise. I should be disputing that connection. The explication of Occam and Scotus modality relies on possible worlds, and to illustrate it, I'll be using these 27. Their names are 1 to 27, and these are the column headings. The row headings in this table indicate time periods. So there are 3 time periods. In each time period, each world can be in one of 3 states, A, B, or C. So there are 3 times 3 times 3 equals 27 possible worlds. Each world might represent my choice of pudding on successive evenings. For instance, A equals apple pie, B equals blueberry pie, C equals cherry pie. For instance, at world 10, I have blueberry pie on the first night, T equals 1, apple pie on the second and third nights. I can now define Occam possibility. The Occam possibilities at a world at a time are those worlds that share its history up to and including that time. For instance, if we look at world 2 at time t equals 2, those possible worlds are world 1, world 2, and world 3, because those are the worlds that share the history of world 2 at t equals 2, including time 2 itself. Similarly, the O possible worlds at world 19 at t equals 1 are the 9 worlds at 19 to 27, because those are the possible worlds that share its history up to and including time t equals 1. Their futures, of course, may differ arbitrarily. Okay, now we'll move on to Scotus modality, and this requires the definition of, first of all, an instant, and second, of the relation of priority. An instant at a world W at a time t is any set of worlds that's true at W and supervenes on the state of the world at t. In other words, it's a true description of the state of W at t. For instance, if we take the proposition that I have apple pie at t equals 1, that's an instant of any of the worlds marked in red, because it describes all of those worlds truly. Moreover, whether it itself is true or false supervenes on the state of the world at t equals 1. The proposition that I have apple pie or cherry pie at t equals 1 is an instant of any of these 18 worlds, 1 to 9, 19 to 27, because again, it describes them truly and it supervenes on the state of the world at t equals 1. And the set of worlds at which I have apple or blueberry pie at t equals 2 is an instant at world 1 at t equals 2. Here, the red background indicates that I'm talking about an instant. That red set is an instant which is true at all the worlds that it includes, including in particular world 1 at time t equals 2. Now, the relation between instants that I'm going to define is that relation of priority, and priority is the converse of subsethood. So if I and I star are simultaneous instants, that is, instants at a world at the same time, then we can say that I star is prior to I if I is a subset of I star. Intuitively, the idea is that the more relaxed instants, the weaker instants, if you like, are prior to the stronger instants. So that if one instant of this world is the proposition that I'm willing something at time t, and another instance of this world at that time is the proposition that I'm willing to sit down at time t, then the instant that I'm willing to sit down is posterior to the instant that I'm willing something. The instant that I'm willing something is prior to the instant that I'm willing to sit down. In this example, the proposition that I have apple or blueberry pie at t equals 1, this is the red region, is prior to the proposition that I have apple pie at t equals 1. Both the instance of world 1 at t equals 1, but the more liberal one, apple or blueberry pie at t equals 1, is prior to the more restrictive one, apple pie at t equals 1. We can finally define a SCOTUS possibility. A proposition P is possible in the SCOTUS sense at an instant I at world W at time t, if P is true at a world in that instant that shares W's pre-t history. If we consider the proposition that I have blueberry pie at t equals 2, that blue proposition, which is worlds 4, 5, 6, 13, 14, 15, 22, 23, 24. That's not possible at instant I at world 2 at t equals 2 if I is the proposition, I is the instant I have apple pie at t equals 2. Because there are no worlds in I at which I have blueberry pie at t equals 2. All the worlds where I have apple pie at t equals 2 rule out the blue proposition. On the other hand, if we consider this same proposition at instant I star at world 1 at t equals 2 now, we're looking at world 1, I star is the proposition that I have apple pie or blueberry pie at t equals 2. That's prior to I. There are worlds in I star that match world 1 prior to t, at which I do have blueberry pie at t equals 2. Here I'm afraid I'm talking about world 1, whereas before I was talking about world 2, but actually it goes for both world 1 and world 2. So both of those instances are instances of those worlds at that time, and I star is prior to I at each world at each time. I star, moreover, is an instant at which the green-blue proposition, I have blueberry pie at t equals 2, is indeed possible. If we now consider the proposition that I have blueberry pie at t equals 2, we see that it's SCOTUS possible, S possible at an instant at world 1 at t equals 2, but it's not O possible at world 1 at t equals 2. So SCOTUS modality allows synchronic possibilities that Occam modality prohibits. SCOTUS modality, or rather S modality, captures two of SCOTUS's ideas. The first one is that a proposition is contingent at the time it describes, and the second that this contingency derives from an ordering of simultaneous instances of nature. That ordering of priority, I've interpreted as being merely the converse of subsethood. Okay, so that's my definition of Occam and SCOTUS modality. Let me now turn to 2 points, on one of which they agree and another of which they disagree. The disagreement between Ockhamism and Scotism that I've discussed so far is merely verbal, and you may think that actually there's no disagreement at all. After all, everyone can agree on what's O possible, and everyone can agree on what's S possible. And as I said, I'll be talking in a moment about things on which both views agree. Nevertheless, there is apparently a disagreement, which we'll discuss in the final section. Both Occam and SCOTUS modality make the past necessary, but you can imagine plenty of modal notions that don't. For instance, metaphysical possibility, or Pascal describes as the sort of maximal open notion of metaphysical possibility, allows the past to be contingent. Things might have been different from the way that they actually are, where that includes the past could have been different. For instance, the world might never have existed, I suppose. So why do we need a modality that makes the past necessary? It is attractive to think that the past is necessary. Why do we need this? One of the connections that Pascal draws towards the end of his paper is that there is a modal arrow of time. What's possible can become impossible, but what's impossible doesn't become possible. For instance, if we look at world 10, the worlds that are Occam possible at that world at time t equals 1 are worlds 10 to 18. Those are all the worlds that share the t equals 1 state of the world 10. At time 2, worlds 10 to 12 remain possible, O possible, at world 10, because those are the worlds that share the state of the world 10 at time t equals 1 and at time t equals 2. And at time t equals 3, only one world is possible, maybe that's world 10 itself. So as we can see, what's possible becomes impossible, the red region shrinks. Moreover, nothing that's impossible becomes possible. Now, I think Pascal has hit upon a connection between modality and time that we find very plausible. That is the idea that possibilities shrink over time, and indeed that it's choices that make them shrink, amongst other things, perhaps, over time. This is a genuine asymmetry, a kind of modal asymmetry in time, but it does not entail the necessity of the past. That's different. To explain why, I'm going to use a different example. In this example, there are 6 possible states, A, B, C, D, E, and F. The laws of metaphysics, or the laws of nature, whatever you like, demand that each state, the states must occur alphabetically at any world, with the convention that A succeeds F. So there are these 6 possible worlds, the worlds that begin in A, in B, in C, in D, in E, in F, and notice that each one evolves alphabetically. Now I'm going to define a notion of possibility that I call Q possibility. I call a world V Q possible at W at T, if and only if for any T dash prior to or including T, the states in V and W are both or neither in the set A, B, C. Intuitively, we can think of A, B, C, D, E, and F as descriptions of the microstate of the world and the laws governing the evolution of a microstate. And we can think of there being a relation of macro indistinguishability between microstates, so worlds that are microscopically different but look to us, let's say, indistinguishable. If that relation of indistinguishability is an equivalence relation, then ABC can be regarded as one of its equivalence classes. So worlds that are Q possible at W at T are worlds that are macro indistinguishable from W up to and including time T. So at world 1, for instance, the Q possible worlds are at time T equals 1, worlds 1, 2, and 3, because world 1 at time 1 is in state A, so it's in a state that belongs to the set ABC. And therefore, the Q possible worlds are other worlds that are also in that state, in a state in that set at time 1. That means world 2 and world 3. At time T equals 2, the Q possible worlds are then world 1 and world 2, because those are the worlds that belong, those are the worlds in which the state at T equals 2 and the state at T equals 1 agree with world 1 with regards to being in this set ABC. Finally, at world 1, the Q possible worlds are at T equals 3, world 1 itself. Now notice that Q modality respects Pasnau's arrow. That is to say, the possible worlds diminish over time. At time 1, the worlds that are possible at world 1, 1, 2, and 3. And then at time 2, and then at time 3, the possibilities diminish. So it is true that what's possible becomes impossible, and nothing that's impossible becomes possible. I've illustrated this in connection with what's possible at world 1 at different times, but it's easy to check that it's true of the other worlds as well. So the possibilities at world 1 and any world diminish as time passes. But the past is not Q necessary. So if we look at time T equals 2, for instance, world 2 is possible at world 1, but it differs over the past. So we've got 2 worlds, world 2 and world 1, each of which is possible from the other at time T equals 2, even though they have different pasts. If you want to think of this in terms of the example that I mentioned, we can imagine that world 1 and world 2 are macro indistinguishable up to time T equals 2, but their microstates might have been different at all previous times. In fact, they would have been in a deterministic setting if they ever were. So the past is contingent on this notion of modality, even though it's a notion of modality that respects Pasnau's arrow. Nothing that's possible, that's impossible becomes possible, but possibilities become lost as time goes on. Now, this counterexample isn't just something I made up. We can see why it might have some sorts of applications. So one obvious application is to do with the analysis of free choice. If we think that human behavior is free in a deterministic context, we might think also that the kind of freedom it has involves a distinctive modality. so that you're free because it was macro possible for you to do otherwise, whether or not it was micro possible. And that means that there are worlds that are macro indistinguishable from yours up to now, at which you then act differently. So for instance, if it's now possible in the relevant sense for me to be standing rather than sitting, that means that the macro history of the world up until now is compatible with my standing rather than sitting. That's allowed on this conception because we're allowing possible worlds in any world to be ones that are macro indistinguishable from it up until that time. But of course, they may have had a different deterministic micro history. This way about thinking about actions, I think goes back at least as far as something that Lower says in the paper that I mentioned there, where he says that human actions have a kind of magnification effect. So that you can have two worlds that are microscopically indistinguishable, that are macroscopically indistinguishable and deterministic, and they start to differ first macroscopically at the time where someone chooses an act or where somebody acts, so that acts can magnify. Human choices can magnify microscopic differences into macroscopic visible differences, and worlds at which they differ might be indistinguishable at a macro level up until the time at which the act takes place. So if human choice has that structure, or if we think it does and want to model it in that way, then a natural sort of modality to choose would be Q possibility. The reason I say all this is just to show that Q possibility isn't just some arbitrary modality that I made up. It's a relatively natural one, according to which the past is contingent, and yet human choices do diminish possibilities, and possibilities in fact diminish over time in just the way that Pasnow's arrow describes. In the context, in a sort of medieval theological context, you might think there are other sorts of examples. So you might think that there are possible worlds in which the past differs because God's foreknowledge differs. So that if it's now possible for me to be standing or to be sitting, then there's a possible world in which I'm standing, and God knew a long time ago that I was going to be standing now. And there's a possible world in which I'm sitting, and God knew a long time ago that it's possible for me to be sitting now. So that's a way in which the past can be contingent, and that too could be modeled by something like Q possibility. It could also therefore be a modality which respects Pasnow's arrow. Let me sum up the argument of this section. We can distinguish two different conditions on modality: monotonicity and one-sidedness. Monotonicity says that the possibilities at one time are a subset of the possibilities at any earlier time, so the possibilities are always diminishing, or at least they're never growing. The second, one-sidedness, says the possibilities at one time all agree over all earlier times, so that's the necessity of the past. What I've argued is that monotonicity does not entail one-sidedness. Failure of conversion, and hence of monotonicity, therefore cannot justify the temporal asymmetry of scotist or Occamist possibility. Now, I should say finally that when I talk about failure of conversion, I'm talking about the principle that what's possible can become impossible, but what's impossible cannot become possible, which isn't quite the principle of conversion that Buridan and Pasnow are discussing. Their version is to do with truth rather than to do with possibility. However, for reasons that I discuss in the paper, I prefer this formulation of the conversion. In any case, on either view, it's correct that Pasnow's identified, I think, an important asymmetry, but it's one that's consistent with the failure of the necessity of the past. The next topic I want to discuss is to do with the necessity of the present, and this is a matter on which Scotus and Occam disagree. So if you remember, the Occam possible worlds at a world W and time t are those that match W at all times before and including t, whereas the Scotus possible worlds at an instant p at world W at time t are those p worlds that match W at all times prior to but not including t. According to Scotus, the existence of an instant p at W at t, such that alternative acts at t are as possible at p at W at t, is necessary for my having acted freely at W at t. He writes, the will at that instant at which it elicits an act of willing is prior by nature to its willing and stands free with regard to it. Accordingly, at that instant at which it elicits its willing, it stands contingent to willing and has a contingent standing toward not willing. This is not because at some prior time it had a contingent standing toward willing, because it was not a cause then. Rather, now, when it is the cause that elicits the act of willing, it has a contingent standing toward the act. as a result, willing at time A, it cannot will at time A. There is an objection to SCOTUS's demand. What SCOTUS is demanding is that the present enters into the modality in two ways. So for me to be freely sitting there, it must now be possible that I now be standing. And we can object that actually either of the ways of taking the present out of that formulation are sufficient for me freely to be sitting there. So one thing would be to say that, well, it's enough for me freely willing A at the present time for it to be possible at that time that I choose not A in the future rather than the present. Another thing you might say is that it's possible for me to be freely willing A now is that at some past time it was possible that I now be freely willing something else. What SCOTUS says in response is that we need to imagine a being with free will who exists for only an instant. Such a being could make a free choice, SCOTUS asserts, but could do so only given the possibility, synchronic with that instant, of doing otherwise. Now, can we imagine this? There is an intuition, I suppose, that an angel who exists instantaneously can be acting freely at the time on which he exists. That intuition, I guess, rests on a kind of intuition about supervenience, which is that whether someone's acting freely at a time depends only on the state of the world at that time. If you grant that supervenience view, then it would follow, I guess, from the fact that a long-lived agent can be acting freely at certain times in its life, that any instantaneous copy of that agent is also acting freely at those times. But we can reject that intuition, or we can reject that as the supervenience claim. We might instead take a historical view of freedom. Whether an act at T is free depends on pre-T states of the world. One way in which you might do that is by saying that freedom of an act depends on its causal history. This has been one response to the debate over Frankfurt cases. But if we say that the causal history of an act can bear on its freedom, we could perhaps also say that its modal history can bear on its freedom as well, so that we can say that if you act freely at a time, then it must have been possible at an earlier time that you chose otherwise. So that doesn't require instantaneous alternatives, it requires alternatives in the past. Of course, if you do take that view, then you might very well want to say that the angel does not act freely, because after all, it certainly wasn't in the angel's power at any earlier time to have acted otherwise, because the angel didn't exist at that earlier time. Again, if the point of attributing freedom is to support attributions of responsibility, then there's another reason why we shouldn't say that instantaneous agents act freely. Why is that? Well, it depends on whether you follow me in perhaps a more contentious claim, which is that the point of attributions of responsibility, for instance, moral responsibility, is to create certain incentives. If you do think that notions like responsibility exist in order to generate incentives, then you might also think that those incentives only affect agents at the point at which they deliberate, i.e. prior to the time at which they act. Attributing moral responsibility to an action, to a type of action, therefore, can only affect whether or not it's performed if it's the type of action that can be affected by incentives. But the only types of action that can be affected by incentives are actions that have a deliberative history. Therefore, there'd be no point in nothing being achieved by attributing moral responsibility, nor therefore freedom, to the acts of instantaneous agents who couldn't have been deliberating before they acted. In short, if we arbitrarily shifted to, supposing we don't already hold on to, a concept of freedom that explicitly ruled out the freedom of instantaneous agents, that would make no difference at all to the incentive effects of the concept of moral responsibility, because that only works on acts that have deliberative history. So for that reason, there would be nothing to stop us, at least from this perspective, there would be nothing to stop us from withholding freedom and moral responsibility from instantaneous angels or instantaneous anything else. It would be the same reason as there is nothing to stop us from withholding agency and freedom and responsibility from acts that were performed accidentally or through insanity. So we could just deny that an instantaneous being could do anything worth calling choosing freely. For that reason, I don't see why freedom requires anything like the synchronic modality that SCOTUS insists upon. Of course, there is another sense in which both SCOTUS and Occam have a synchronic sense of modality. That is, they allow there to be simultaneously possible incompatible descriptions of the state of the world at some time, in particular at some future time. So that it's now possible that I'm sitting at some future time t, and it's also now possible that I'm standing at that future time t. So there is right now a kind of synchronicity between possibilities that obtain right now concerning the future. That kind of synchronicity distinguishes both Occam and SCOTUS possibility from mere temporal possibility, which is the third notion, modal notion, that Pasnow discusses. I say obviously more about that in the written paper than in this presentation. I'll just close by saying that, of course, there is a debate over whether the alternativeness on which Occam and SCOTUS possibility agree is necessary for human freedom and human choice. And of course, that is something on which the Frankfurt examples and the debate following the Frankfurt examples has a great bearing. Indeed, I think that it casts severe doubt on the idea that any notion of possibility that's synchronic in the sense in which SCOTUS and Occam agree is necessary for us to distinguish free from unfree actions. That, however, is another debate, and not the one between SCOTUS and Occam that I've been focusing on today. Thank you very much.